Today on Sporty's Fast 5 podcast, we're diving into the fascinating world of flight simulators with pilot and flight sim expert Chris McGonegle. He explains how Microsoft reinvented its famous program, what the latest trends are in home simulators, and some mistakes to avoid when flying virtually. Fast 5 starts right now. Welcome, pilots. I'm your host, John Zimmerman, and today I'm joined in the studio by Chris McGonegle. He's a colleague of mine at Sporty's, where he leads the flight simulator department, so it's safe to say he is an expert on the digital flying industry. But he's also a commercial pilot and a real aviation enthusiast, so he really lives in both worlds. Chris, welcome to Fast 5.
Thanks for having me, John.
All right, so I knew we had to have you on the show because flight simulators are so hot right now. They've been around for decades. We both probably grew up flying them, I'm going to assume. But it seems like interest in them over the last year just exploded. Why is that?
Well, I attribute it to a few things. First off, computing power. We have gotten to a point where a simulator has a lot of abilities for a typical at-home PC that previous iterations or even 3 or 4 years ago, they didn't have the ability to do. So that's the first one I attribute to. Second would be we were stuck indoors for almost a full year. So, people had a lot more disposable income. We're not traveling, and this new program from Microsoft comes out. And it was kind of a surprise when it came out. They announced it at E3 in 2019 that they were working on something. They didn't say when it was coming or when they were planning to release it. And then in July of 2020, they came out and said, you know what? In 1 month, it's commercial ready. So it was kind of get to the races, everyone start prepping, getting ready, find out what you can. And I think that build up and that excitement and everyone being at home, that is really what angled us towards this end of the year 2020 immense interest in Microsoft Flight Simulator and therefore other simulator programs also.
So one of the things that surprised me is how it's rapidly expanded beyond just flight sim enthusiasts, which is obviously a large and long-running group of people, but it's really spilled over. So do you think for maybe a less tech-savvy pilot, is it a good time to get into this now? Is it still intimidating?
I think so. They really made a big approach or attempt, I should say, on the user interface. It's no longer clicking on a whole bunch of tabs and setting your conditions and then hitting a button, watching it load, and hoping you enter the right information. It's really user-friendly. A part of that could be contributed to seeing how easy it is to work with current iPhones and how that's translated to we don't want something extremely specific. Make it easy, and if someone wants to get granular, they can. So I've recorded a couple videos and sent it to customers who've asked for it saying, hey, what are the first 5 minutes like? And just to show the ease with turning it on, clicking a couple buttons, and then you're at your digital airport, engine running, ready to go. I think that's been a very easy segue for, like you said, not necessarily technically savvy pilots to really enjoy some of these programs.
Do you think this renewed interest in the flight simulator world can help grow general aviation, where maybe it's not just flight sim enthusiasts, but it can draw people into being a pilot?
I think very much so. My early days, I still remember firing up my dad's PC and turning on one of the early iterations. It was a very low quality program, but I'd be able to see my heading, my airspeed, maybe a couple airports coming. And that was a really beginning level of my interest level when it came to aviation. I know a lot of the pilots at Sporty's have very similar stories. And I think we're going to see a lot of that overlap today. I don't like to use the term game. I like to stay in the simulator bounds. But I think there are a lot of young people who will look at it as a game and then start to realize the takeaway of it being a simulator as a game. So I like to think that we are going to have a wave of renewed interest when it comes to general aviation and hopefully introductory flights.
So for somebody who's interested in this and wants to take the first step with a home simulator, what's your advice for them? Are there mistakes to avoid or things you should definitely do?
I absolutely think there are mistakes you can make. I kind of look at the end results. Are you using the simulator as a fun way to pass time? Is it to make some really great wallpapers on your laptop or your PC? Is it something where you want to learn how to fly an instrument approach or critique an instrument approach or work on your communication skills? Knowing the end results will really help you when it comes to looking at the simulator software options that are out there. I like to refer to the software as kind of the brain of the entire system. As mentioned, Microsoft's program is the newest. It's very vivid. It's beautiful. You can find eons of videos on YouTube. So there's a lot of content out there if you want to see it. But a little bit of the aerodynamics are lacking, and they've done a lot of upgrades. It's a little over a year and a quarter old, but they're still working out some of those aerodynamics. Other simulators, they may not be the most portrait ready. They may not be as pretty. They may not show as much of a reflection on the waves of a lake from the sun, but yet the aerodynamics are great. A lot of the approach plates are up to speed. A lot of the avionics are up to date. So you will have all the initial and final approach fixes accurate to what you would fly in, say, your 172. So you really have to look at it from a standpoint of, do I want to have some fun? Do I want to go see some beautiful sights? Or do I want to use this as a tool to be a better pilot? And once you've answered that question, you can really grab into which program works best for you.
And if I do want to use it as a tool, is there value for both a VFR and an IFR pilot, or is this mostly just flying around visually?
I think there's a lot of value to pilots from all programs. There's some programs, say Microsoft, that I would associate with, say, a VFR or private pilot. You get great views out the airplane using a lot of what's above the dash and kind of looking at your outside reference points. Microsoft is the top there. If you want to stay more focused inside the airplane, I still remember putting my Francis IFR hood on and not being able to see outside the aircraft for, I think it was 9 months. In that scenario where you want accurate indications on your instruments, I recommend X-Plane. It's a more seasoned program, and it's really focused on the aerodynamics. That is the foundation that program's built on. So I like that one. You know, when you're departing an airport and you pitch for VY and your power settings and your weight, you get very accurate results compared to others. So I look at instrument as X-Plane, and then finally, let's say you want a career in aviation, you're a commercial pilot or you're transferring to that. Prepared is actually a very good program from Lockheed Martin. It's very objective driven, it's missions driven, and it gives you a lot of, okay, here's what today's objectives are, let's go fly, rather than, and I'm subject to this myself, just jumping on a PC, turn it on, and seeing where the wind takes me. So those are kind of the ways I like to relate it to someone who's either in those phases of training or has that mindset for their training.
So I think you bring up a great point there about, hey, let's just, fire up, get in the Boeing and go do loops and rolls, which we're all guilty of, and there's nothing wrong with that from time to time. But for somebody who does want to use it for real training, what are your tips there? How do you approach it so that you get some training value out of it versus just having fun?
Sure. I think having an objective every time really, really helps. So, telling yourself, hey, this week I want to fly 5 ILS approaches down to minimums plus 200. That's a great way to say, here's a skill, I know how to use it, and I'm going to critique it. I like to use the analogy, you shouldn't learn an exercise with it, but you should strengthen a muscle. A lot of instructors, a lot of people who have been instructors will say, you never want to learn a maneuver from a flight simulator, but you can absolutely critique it after you've done it a few times with an instructor. So going into it and saying, I want to practice this maneuver, I want to practice this approach, I want to really test some of the physics of the aircraft, that's where the benefits are. But kind of as you hinted at earlier on, and I'm guilty of this, I will sometimes turn it on, fly around, say, hey, it looks like the weather's nice in San Diego, let's go see what it's like out there. And before I know it, 30 minutes are gone, and all I've done is had a sightseeing digital flight. So it's important to have missions, but I also want to say that these are simulators, they are fun. So don't look at it as, a syllabus, if you will.
So maybe after you've shot your ILS approaches, you can pull up for a little aerobatics if you want.
Absolutely.
And are there some things you just avoid? I mean, I often have heard people say, well, you're not going to learn how to do crosswind landings in a simulator. So are there some things that a sim is just never going to be good for, no matter how good it is?
Yes. A lot of these designers and developers, they focus on 95% of the cake. There's still a few things that are lacking. And what you hinted at, crosswind, approach and landings, I've yet to really find a commercial simulator that offers that and is accurate. And relatively the entire flaring process. I know some simulator programs, they have it on their target list to work on ground effect. That's a pretty darn important thing when you're trying to get realistic. And then jokingly, another one is taxiing. I had a couple calls last week with customers saying, I've got the program running. When I'm taking straight off, it's great. When I'm firing it up and taxiing to the runway, I can't get it to work. And I told them, and I meant this in all seriousness, if there's a developer who comes up with a great taxiing program, they're going to make millions because it has yet to happen in the flight sim industry. So there's little things that aren't as accurate as what you would expect in the real world, which is why I always like to say you can't use a simulator to take care of practicing landings, practicing crosswind landings, those types of things. But you can absolutely use it for approaches. You can use it for some of the earlier maneuvers, think steep turns, think maybe some stalls. But when it comes to the real precision maneuvers, some of the simulators are lacking.
Yeah, somebody once told me the simulators are great until you get within 10 feet of the ground. And I think there's still a lot of truth in that.
Very accurate.
We've talked a lot about software here and X-Plane versus Microsoft and all that, but let's pull out for a second and talk about hardware because that is an important part of this. If I try to dust off my old Windows XP computer with a keyboard and a mouse, I think you would agree that's a terrible experience. So what are the hardware considerations I should have in mind if I want to actually get some training value out of a home simulator?
I like to say you should sim as you fly. So if you're a Cessna pilot and you need a yoke, there are a lot of yoke options out there. There's actually some new entrants to the market in the last 2 years, and I think they were very lucky on their timing to come out and debut when they did and then take advantage of this big wave of interest. But there's really a lot out there from all price ranges. You can find a good yoke with some throttles for about $170, $180. You can find an upgrade on that, which will have ball bearings and a metal shaft and a full 90 degrees rotation left and right for a little under $300, or you can go all the way up towards some of the basic aviation training devices, the things that are certified by the FAA. You could get a yoke of that style for about $800. Now, there's a lot in between, but the point I'm trying to make is whether you want to spend around $100 or you want to spend something for that big trainer that they use, to train commercial pilots or train military pilots, you have that ability these days. Sticks are another overlooked feature, I think, when it comes to flight simulators. If you've got limited desk space, I'm guilty of that in the office. I want something that does a lot in a small space. A stick can take care of all the same things a yoke does, and usually then some in a smaller footprint. So to your point of hardware and being important, in the last 2 years, Sporty's has expanded our hardware offering from about 26 products up to, I think we're right around 50 in the hardware realm. So there really has been a deluge of a lot of options for the customer. And we really try and critique ourselves to make sure that we cover all the bases and give you as much information as possible so you can make a well-educated purchase.
Yeah, but trying to practice these maneuvers with a keyboard and a mouse is a mistake, I think. And that's always I'm not half the flight sim expert you are, but my advice is invest in a yoke and some rudder pedals. Even if they're basic, it makes a huge difference just in terms of some basic muscle memory.
Absolutely. You're not going to be able to enjoy the experience if you're using the arrow keys on your keyboard for pitch and roll. So in this day and age, it's almost blasphemy.
All right, Chris, we're going to take a quick break and we'll be back with some more questions.
Okay.
Sporty's is your one-stop shop for the best flight simulator gear, from Honeycomb and Logitech to Thrustmaster and Redbird. Count on Sporty's for the guaranteed lowest prices, fast shipping, and helpful advice from our team of pilots. Not sure what the best option is? Check out our library of articles and videos to help you make an informed decision. Find it all at sportys.com/simulator. Now, back to Fast 5.
Chris, one question we get a lot at Sporty's, I know, has to do with the legality of home simulators. And sometimes that gets boiled down to, can I log the time I spend in X-Plane or Microsoft Flight Simulator? So let's tackle that subject. Is there anything I can do in my logbook from these sims?
The answer to that question is yes. A very common conversation I have with our customer service is regarding legality, because a lot of customers call in and say, hey, can I use my at-home flight simulator to log approaches or to put ink in my logbook? And the long answer to that question is yes, you can, but you need something that's called a basic aviation training device. And these devices have been certified and verified and checked by the FAA. They make sure that it's top-of-the-line hardware that's configured to a setting and a preset software, and then it's tested. And once the realism and the precision of the whole package is verified, they can then sign off on it and say, you can use this to go out and simulate flying at home similar to what would happen in the real world. So it's called a basic aviation training device. Now, I will say one of these devices will cost you quite a bit, probably a small used sedan vehicle. But they will allow you to log approaches at home. So it's a nice way to stay current if you get to those colder months where maybe you can't go flying. Yet your instrument recency is getting a little close to lapsing. You can do the 6 and 6, as they call it, from home without an instructor. So that's a real big appeal. You can also use it for 2.5 hours of earning a private pilot certificate with an instructor. That's worth mentioning. But just as you can use a basic aviation training device to supplement a little bit of your private training, this will qualify for that, but you will need an instructor. And to go on a little bit of a tangent here, they are expensive pieces, but there's a lot of value there. I think with a flying club, all kind of getting one and then multiple pilots taking advantage of that instrument currency is a very valuable asset. And then someone who's kind of towards the end of a flying career, but they don't want to get away from flying. If you want to get a very precise machine, this is one worth considering for them.
Now, if I've got just a basic home computer with Microsoft Flight Simulator and a honeycomb yoke, I'm not going to be logging anything. But does that mean I'm out of luck and there's no value there?
I wouldn't say there's no value. Yeah, you're correct. You can't add ink to your logbook, so you can't log anything, but you can absolutely gain value. I still remember my training, which wasn't as long ago as it feels like. And I remember trying to research if there was a Garmin 430 simulator I could find online. And I really struck out after, an hour of researching it. I found all the forums, I found all these users manuals, but I couldn't find something that really showed if I turn the dial 5 times and I hit this button, what happens? A lot of these programs now offer that. So a lot of people look at it as I can jump in a 172 and go fly from my home airport to this airport, but they overlook the fact that you've got a full avionics simulator sitting right in front of you. You can sit on the tarmac, engines running, load in your flight plan, see what happens when you go to the 5th chapter of this page. You can really take a lot away from that. And then another side effect is communications. That's another side to the whole simulation growing business, to where there are now companies or sites that allow you to talk to real people while you're simming. So something that I struggled with was I was hesitant to talk to controllers because I was intimidated. It's someone who is official. They're always short. I now know why. And they're effective and efficient. And I, at first, was very hesitant or worrisome of messing up my call and overstepping my time on the radios. Well, I think a simulator would have benefited at least me, because I can have those conversations with a real person, start to figure out, which I did, it's just another person trying to help you out as you're flying, and get rid of those humps that can be detrimental to early training or cause you to have butterflies in your stomach when you're going to that lesson.
Yeah, that was a real eye-opener for me. Something that was new, at least since my first flight sim days, is that whole option with Pilot Edge and those other services you mentioned is a pretty interesting upgrade to really take your simming to the next level. I think it's a great example of what the internet has done to take simming kind of in a different direction. Agreed.
And those are just a couple of the side gains, if you will, that simulators offer. So there's really a lot of things that you can use from a simulator to be proficient in an airplane. A great quote from a hardware designer that I heard a few weeks back is, focus on saving hours rather than logging hours. And I think that is extremely applicable. You can really save some hours by using a simulator.
Yeah, that's great advice. If I save 3 hours in the airplane, with my flight instructor, that's worth more than, anything I can do logging it. So that's great advice. Before we wrap up with our Ready to Copy segment, a non-simulator question for you. I think we've given you enough of those. You wrote a very thoughtful series of articles last year about your journey as a rusty pilot. And we've talked to some other guests on this show about how they got current again in that process. But I'm sort of interested in your perspective on the other side of it, which is how do you keep the rust from forming in the first place? Is that just inevitable? Or looking back, do you think there's some things that pilots can do to try to keep that rust away?
I think it's kind of both. It is a little inevitable. If you leave anything outside metal long enough, it's going to start accruing rust, for the little joke there. But I think just as pilots who use the term rusty pilot, we have to continuously challenge ourselves to go flying. There are so many times where I'd not want to come in early and log a flight, or it's a beautiful day at home, I'm going to kick my feet up and watch a football game or something of that sort. But having the desire and the drive to continuously fly, I think that is a need. I want to say it was a few years ago, or right when I was getting back into flying, I challenged myself, all right, I'm going to fly once a week in June. I need 4 flights, no ifs, ands, or buts. If I got to come in at crack of dawn, I'm going to get an airplane and I'm going to go get a coffee before going into the office. Or I want to go see what the sunrise from Northern Kentucky is like, working in Cincinnati. Things of that sort. You really have to do that. And it's kind of similar to, like I touched on earlier, of when you fire up a simulator, having a mission and objective. It's the same with staying away from becoming a rusty pilot. Everyone says time flies, and it does. And before you know it, it's been a month since you've gone flying, and then it's been 3, and it's been 6. And you start to look at yourself as, man, I hope, physics haven't changed. When I come into flare this 172, it still operates the same way. So I really think it's one of those where whether you mark it on a calendar, whether you tell yourself, if I see the weather's going to be great tomorrow, I'm reserving an aircraft. You have to stay on top of it to make sure you stay away from being a rusty pilot, because when you fall out of recency like I was subject to, it can be very intimidating coming back and very challenging. Luckily, I had a really good group to work with and a very helpful field from the Claremont County Airport. So coming back was a really fun experience for me. But I highly recommend to pilots, do everything you can to keep away from becoming a rusty pilot.
I think one of my early flight instructors told me you have to schedule time with yourself on that if you wait for the free time to appear to go flying, it'll never happen, right? So
there's always 1,000 excuses not to.
Exactly. So if it's a priority, you have to, like you said, put it on the calendar. All right, Chris, at the end of these shows, as you probably know, we always end with a segment called Ready to Copy. So I'll throw out some questions. You give me your quick answer. Are you ready to copy?
I am ready to copy.
I'm going to put you on the spot with the Coke or Pepsi question. Do you personally prefer X-Plane or Microsoft Flight Simulator?
Microsoft Flight Simulator. I feel like the delta between Microsoft Flight Simulator and X-Plane has been shrinking, and it's tough to get away from those beautiful views.
What was the first flight simulator you ever flew? Do you remember what version it was?
Based off when I was born, I'm going to predict it was Flight Simulator 4 or 5. So that would have been around 94, 95. It was very early, to answer your question.
And did you take off from Meigs Field in Chicago?
Regrettably, I did not know about the ambiance of Meigs Field, so I did not.
What's your favorite place to fly in a simulator? So what should be on my next digital flight plan here?
So it's a place I like to fly a lot in a simulator. It's also one I hope to fly to eventually in my flying career is Donegal Bay in Ireland. It's on the northwestern side. It's where the McGonegle clan hails from. So every once in a while I like to jump in a Cessna 172 or maybe something with a little more power and go cruise around that area.
That's a great idea. I had not thought of that. A little family genealogy by flight simulator.
Absolutely.
That's a fantastic idea. And what is another Coke Pepsi question for you in the simulator world? What is your preferred hardware? What yoke or stick do you fly with most often?
So the yoke and sibling throttle I fly with the most is the Honeycomb Alpha and the Honeycomb Bravo. I feel like the value they offer is almost more than what you're paying. They are really good pieces. They're realistic. And I really enjoy flying with these majority of the time. When it comes to the throttle, still at the price it's at today, I feel like it's a steal when you get one. Now, they are more difficult to find because we're still in that phase of ramping up, having enough for the market. Getting your hands on one you don't get buyer's remorse, let's put it that way. But there's so many ways to configure it for general aircraft, for multi-engine, for commercial jets. I really have a lot of value with it. So when it comes time to, hey, I'm going to jump in the simulator and go fly around, those are usually my default go-tos.
If you're in charge of Flight Simulator with magical powers, what's the one thing you would like to fix?
The physics when landing would be great, because if a simulator could say that this is 95% realistic to how you flare the aircraft when you're coming into land, or the way you do a slip into land an aircraft, that would be great. So I would love if that could be fixed. And then loading time. Let's put it that way. It's always fun when you've got a flight planned, you've got everything set up. I've got my iPad going so I can use other EFBs in tandem with my flight simulator. And I'm waiting for it to load. So those would be the things I would clean up.
Not too long ago, you took your wife on her first small airplane ride, which it sounds like was a success. What's your best tip for flying with a somewhat nervous flyer or new passenger?
I would say the best tip is over-explain everything. After we flew, we got some great photographs. We went to an amazing dinner, northwestern Indianapolis, and really had a great flight. But I ended up finding out that the scariest time for her was when I turned over the engine and the whole thing shook. And that's something we just don't think about as pilots because we're so used to it. I've probably turned those keys 400 or 500 times. So over-explaining everything, talking about why an airplane does what it does, the little nuances that we have forgotten from our first pre-flight. That's what I recommend covering, and that way you're not scaring them when the flight hasn't even started.
Good advice. Very good advice. Like me, Chris, you are a book lover, so I'm looking for recommendations. What's your favorite aviation book?
Favorite aviation book, and I'm going to sound stale with this response, but Stick and Rudder.
All right. It deserves the hype, huh?
It does. I can tell you its part number at Sporty's because every time I walk by M101, I always look up because I enjoy the book. But I'm rereading it now, actually, ironically, and there's still things when this book was written that apply to today, and ways to think about how the aircraft operates in the air and what control inputs do that, I catch myself saying, oh, yeah, I remember when I was flying a 172 and I noticed that also. So it's one of those evergreen books that even though some of the terminology has changed in the aviation industry, the ideas and what he's trying to relay are really, really good.
Our last question, as you know, is always the same, so you're probably prepared for this one, but we're going to ask it anyway. You have one final flight. We want to know, what are you flying and where are you going?
All right, so I kind of gave a lead into this earlier, but I would love to take my wife over to Ireland in a 182, and it's not going to be a last flight, but it's going to be a final planned course of flying along the coast and taking in that entire country from just over the water, and then maybe ending it, as I said, in Donegal Bay. But I would love to see Ireland from about 2,000 to 3,000 feet AGL in its entirety.
Chris, thanks for being on Fast Five.
Thank you for having me, John.
Thanks for listening to Fast Five, brought to you by Sporty's Pilot Shop. For more episodes and links to additional information, visit sportys.com/podcast. And if you have comments or guest ideas, email podcast@sportys.com. I'm John Zimmerman. We'll see you next time on Fast Five.